My daughter said I wasn't welcome at her wedding. She didn't know I was paying for it. I found out I wasn't invited to my own daughter's wedding from a text message that took her 4 minutes to write and me 4 months to fully understand. Most parents know this feeling, even if they never say it out loud. You spend your whole life building a family, and one day you realize it's quietly moved on without asking if you're coming. I was standing in the parking lot of the Ashford Grand, in my one good suit, holding a card with my daughter's name on it. The October air, cold enough to see my breath, when the wedding coordinator looked at her clipboard, looked at me, and said, "I'm sorry, sir, I don't see you on the list." I didn't know yet that the list in her hands wasn't even the right one. Behind her, through the glass doors, I could see the string lights, the white folding chairs, the life my daughter had built for herself. And I want you to remember that moment, because everything I'm about to tell you led to it, and almost none of it happened the way anyone in that room believed. My name is Robert Hale. I'm 62. I spent 35 years as a general contractor in Ohio, and I raised my daughter Emily mostly on my own, in a house I built with my own hands, in a town where everybody still waves at everybody on Main Street. I'm not a complicated man. I believe in showing up, paying what I owe, and keeping quiet about the things I do for people I love. That last part is probably what got me into trouble. My wife died when Emily was 7. Cancer. Fast and merciless. The kind that doesn't give you time to prepare the things you wish you'd said. I remember the fluorescent hum of the hospital hallway the night before she passed, the smell of hand sanitizer and bad coffee, Diane grabbing my hand and telling me, "Whatever happens, don't let our girl grow up thinking love has to be loud to be real." I didn't understand what she meant back then. I understand it now better than I'd like to. I raised Emily alone after that. I learnt to braid hair from a YouTube video at 11 at night. I coached her softball team for 6 years, worked every overtime shift I could get, because love, in my experience, usually looks like a mortgage payment and a full refrigerator. Emily grew up steady, kind, the way kids get when they've watched a parent hold everything together by hand. She became a marketing coordinator in Columbus, met Preston Whitfield at a work conference 3 years ago, and within a year they were engaged. I liked Preston fine, quiet, a little unsure of himself around his own family, which I understood the moment I met his mother. Margaret Whitfield ran a home the way some people run a courtroom. Everything had a correct answer, and she was the only one allowed to give it. The first time I met her, at an engagement dinner at a steakhouse Emily could never have afforded on her own, Margaret shook my hand, looked me up and down, and said, "Emily tells us you're in construction." 35 years, I said. "How charming," she said, and turned back to her wine. I know some of you are already forming an opinion of Margaret. I understand why, but I don't think she was cruel because she enjoyed it. I think she was scared of a world that didn't run the way she needed it to. That doesn't make it hurt less. It just makes it easier to forgive, eventually. The wedding planning started about 8 months before the ceremony, and for the first few weeks, everything felt normal. Emily called most Sundays, sent pictures of venues, asked what I thought about outdoor versus indoor ceremonies. About 6 weeks in, she called and told me something that changed the whole shape of things. "Dad," she said, "Preston's parents want to talk about the budget." I already knew what that meant before she said the next part. The Whitfields had money. Old money. The kind that gets passed down instead of earned. In families like that, money isn't just money. It's a leash. They said they'd cover most of it, Emily told me, as long as Margaret can help plan things. She's really particular. I remember sitting at my kitchen table that night, looking at the chair where Diane used to sit, and making a decision I never told anyone about, not even Emily. I called my accountant the next morning and quietly transferred $85,000 into a separate account. I called the venue coordinator, the caterer, and the florist, and I told all three of them the same thing. Send the invoices to me directly, and don't mention it to anyone else. I wasn't trying to be a hero. I did it because I knew if the Whitfields were paying, they'd own every decision, and I knew my daughter well enough to know she'd disappear into what they wanted, instead of what she wanted. I thought if I quietly handled the money, Emily could still have a say in her own wedding, without anyone using a checkbook to make her feel small. I didn't realize I was about to make myself the one who felt small instead. For the next few months, I watched from a distance as Margaret took over almost everything. The color palette, the band, the seating chart, all decided by a woman who wasn't the one actually paying for any of it, though, of course, she didn't know that. Slowly, I stopped being copied on the planning emails. I stopped getting called about details. When I'd ask Emily how things were going, her answers got shorter, more careful, like she was reading off a script someone else had written for her. "Everything's under control, Dad," she'd say. "Margaret's got it handled." I didn't know yet that handled meant something very different to Margaret than it did to me. I told myself it was normal. Brides get busy. Future mothers-in-law get involved. I told myself a lot of things that spring, mostly because the alternative was admitting how much it hurt to watch my daughter slip further away with every call. The first real cut came about 4 months before the wedding, at a Sunday dinner Margaret hosted at her home. I was there, at the far end of a long table, when Margaret raised her glass and said, "I just want to say how thrilled Richard and I are to be able to give Emily and Preston the wedding of their dreams." Everyone clapped. Emily smiled and thanked her. Preston nodded along, eyes on his plate. I sat there with my hand around a glass of water, watching my daughter thank another woman for a gift I'd already quietly paid for, and I didn't say a single word. Afterward, in the kitchen, while I was helping clear plates out of habit, Margaret found me alone. "Robert," she said, drying her hands on a towel she didn't need, "I hope you understand. We just want everything to feel elegant, cohesive. I'm sure you understand how these things can get complicated with too many voices involved." I understood exactly what she was telling me. Fewer voices meant hers, and hers alone. I just wasn't ready yet to tell her what I knew. About 2 weeks after that dinner, the florist called me directly, a little apologetic, asking if I'd approved a request to reroute future invoices to a P.O. box under Margaret's name instead of mine. I hadn't even known a request like that had been made. I told the florist to keep everything exactly as the contract specified, thanked her, and hung up. But the call sat with me the rest of that week. If Margaret was quietly trying to take over the paperwork, I couldn't help but wonder what else she was trying to take over, and how long she'd been at it. By 2 months out, the emails had stopped completely. I found out the final head count from a photo Emily posted online, not a phone call. When I texted her about it, she took almost a full day to respond. "Sorry, Dad, things have just been hectic. I'll call you soon, I promise." She didn't call soon. 3 weeks before the wedding, I drove to Columbus to see her in person. We sat at the same coffee shop we used to go to every Saturday morning when she was in high school, back when it felt like just the two of us against the world. I asked her, as gently as I knew how, what my role was going to be at the ceremony. She looked down at her coffee for a long moment before she answered. "Margaret and Preston think it might be simpler," she said slowly, "if the wedding party stays smaller, more intimate." "Emily," I said, "am I invited to your wedding?" The silence that followed was the longest 10 seconds of my life. "It's complicated, Dad," she finally said. "Margaret feels like, with the Whitfield family image and some of Preston's business contacts being there, it might be better if it's just simpler." I didn't yell. I didn't remind her who paid for the tuxedo Preston would be wearing. I just nodded and said, "Okay, sweetheart, I understand." I didn't understand, not even close. But I'd learnt a long time ago that some conversations, pushed at the wrong moment, close a door that never fully opens again. I drove home that night with the radio off, and somewhere around mile 40, I made a decision. I wasn't going to fight for my seat at that wedding. I'd keep my word, keep paying what I'd committed to, and let the truth come out on its own time. If you're watching this, and you've ever loved someone enough to keep a secret that was costing you something, you already know how heavy that kind of silence gets. If this story is hitting home, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this reach people who need to hear it. Over the next 3 weeks, I did something I'm still not sure was wise. I kept paying. The final catering balance came due 9 days before the wedding, $22,000 for a reception I wasn't invited to attend. I paid it without hesitation, quietly, directly, no note attached. My friend Walt, who's known me since we hung drywall together at 22, was the only person I told the whole truth to. We were sitting on my porch the week before the wedding when I finally said it out loud. Walt set his bottle down slow, like he needed both hands free for what he was about to say. "You're paying for a wedding you're not invited to." "I am," I said. "Robert, that's insane." "Maybe. Why don't you just tell her? Tell all of them?" I looked out at my yard, at the tree Diane and I planted the year Emily was born, now taller than the house. "Because this was never about being right, Walt," I said. "If I tell them now, out of anger, it becomes a weapon. I don't want to hand my daughter a wound like that. If she ever finds out, I want her to find out because it's true, not because I used it to win something." Walt didn't say anything else. He just nodded and let the quiet sit between us the way old friends know how to do. 4 days before the wedding, Emily called with an update that had nothing to do with logistics. "Dad, Preston's dad's business partners are coming to the reception. Margaret wants everything to look a certain way." I could hear something else underneath the words. When I asked if everything was all right, she paused a beat too long before telling me it was fine. I hung up that night with a feeling I couldn't shake, that something else was shifting inside that family. I wouldn't understand what it was until the day of the wedding itself. The morning of the wedding, I put on the suit I'd bought months earlier, when I still believed I'd be standing at the altar, watching my daughter walk toward her future. I drove to the Ashford Grand anyway, not to attend, but because the final envelope, the last vendor payment, needed to be dropped off in person, per the contract I'd signed. I handed it to the wedding coordinator at the front desk, along with a card for Emily that just said, "I love you today, same as every day, Dad." Then I asked, out of habit more than hope, if I was on the guest list. She checked her clipboard, apologized, and told me I wasn't. I nodded, thanked her, and walked back to my truck. I sat in that parking lot for almost 20 minutes, watching the string lights flicker on as the sky started to dim, listening to the faint sound of music drifting out from the reception hall, and I told myself I'd done the right thing. I told myself love doesn't need to be witnessed to be real. I was 3 miles down the road, almost home, when my phone rang. It was a Columbus number I didn't recognize. "Mr. Hale, this is Sarah, the wedding coordinator at the Ashford Grand. I'm so sorry to bother you, but I think there's been a mix-up with the final invoice, and I was told to call the primary contact on file for payment questions. Is now an okay time?" I pulled over onto the shoulder of the highway. "I'm listening," I said. "There's a small discrepancy on the catering overage, about $1,100, and I need authorization to process it. You're listed as the primary billing contact for the Hale-Whitfield wedding." I hadn't thought about what that phrase would sound like, said out loud, by a stranger, 3 miles from home, still in my one good suit. What I didn't know was that Sarah had stepped just outside the reception doors to take the call, in a hallway right next to where Margaret Whitfield was standing with 2 of her closest friends. Margaret, I found out later, heard every word of it. "Primary billing contact," she reportedly repeated, loud enough that a few nearby guests turned to look. "For the Hale-Whitfield wedding." I authorized the payment, thanked Sarah, and hung up. with no idea that inside that building, the story everyone believed had just quietly started to collapse. Margaret found the coordinator within minutes and asked her point blank, who exactly had been paying for the wedding? Sarah, being an honest woman just doing her job, didn't see any reason to lie. "Mr. Hale," she said, "he's been the contact on every invoice since the beginning. Venue, catering, florist, the band, all of it." Sarah pulled up something else while she was at it, something that made her go quiet for a second herself. The venue's official confirmed guest record, tied to the signed contract, had my name on it the entire time. The clipboard at the front desk, the one that had turned me away twice, wasn't the venue's master list. It was a separate seating chart Margaret's assistant had submitted the week before, missing 12 names, mine among them. I found out what happened next only because Emily told me herself, weeks later, piece by piece. Margaret went pale, then quiet, the specific quiet of someone doing fast math on every comment she'd made for 8 months. Emily, standing nearby in her wedding dress, only caught the last part of it. Something about an invoice, something about her father's name. She pulled Sarah aside herself, her voice low but urgent. "What is she talking about?" Emily asked. "What do you mean my dad's name is on the invoices?" Sarah, not fully understanding the weight of what she was about to hand over, told her plainly. Her father had paid every vendor invoice for the wedding since the initial deposit 8 months ago. Emily has told me since that she stood there in the hallway, in a dress she thought Margaret's family had paid for, and felt the last 8 months rearrange themselves in her memory. Every comment about keeping things elegant, every time she'd been told it would be simpler without me. All of it had been about controlling money that was never Margaret's to control. Emily didn't scream. For a moment she just stood there, guests moving around her, laughter drifting down the hall, the day she'd built going on without her for a few seconds too long. Part of her wanted to smooth it over, finish the night, ask questions later. The version of herself that had spent 8 months believing the quiet path was always the easiest one. But she thought about every dinner where she'd let a lie sit unchallenged between them, and she decided she was done being quiet on somebody else's behalf. She walked straight to Preston, took his hand, and asked one question. "Did you know?" He shook his head, looking as stunned as she did. Then she walked out the front doors of the Ashford Grand, in her wedding dress, into the parking lot, looking for a truck that had already left. I was 2 miles from home when my phone rang again. This time it was Emily. "Dad," she said, breathless, like she'd been running, "where are you? Please don't drive any further. Please turn around." I turned my truck around on a dark county road, my heart going faster than I want to admit to you, and drove straight back to the Ashford Grand. When I pulled into that same parking lot for the second time that night, Emily was standing outside under those string lights in her wedding dress, arms wrapped around herself against the cold, and the moment she saw my headlights, she started walking toward me before I'd even come to a full stop. I got out of the truck, and she wrapped her arms around me the way she used to when she was 7 years old and scared of thunderstorms. "I'm so sorry," she kept saying, over and over. I didn't know it was you the whole time. I'm so sorry." I held on to my daughter in that parking lot for a long time. None of what I felt was vindication. I didn't feel like I'd won anything. I just felt like, after 8 months of silence, my daughter finally knew the truth, and she'd chosen to walk out into a parking lot in her wedding dress to find me the second she learnt it. We went back inside together. I won't pretend it wasn't awkward, walking into a room full of people who'd spent the night believing a different story. But Emily didn't let it stay awkward for long. She found the microphone at the head table, and in front of 200 guests, she said something I don't think I'll ever forget as long as I live. "I want to introduce someone properly," she said, her voice steady though I could see her hands shaking. "This is my father, Robert Hale. He raised me alone after my mother passed when I was 7. He's paid for every part of this wedding, quietly, without asking for credit. I almost let people talk me out of having him here tonight. I'm not making that mistake for one more minute. Then she asked me to give the toast I'd never been scheduled to give. I'm not a man comfortable with public speaking. I've built houses, not speeches. But I stood up, looked at my daughter, and told her the only thing I really knew to be true. Your mother told me once that love doesn't have to be loud to be real. I said, I've spent your whole life trying to prove that to you quietly. I'm sorry it took this long for the quiet part to be heard. Margaret didn't say much the rest of that night. She didn't need to. Sometimes the most honest consequence a person can face is simply being seen clearly, for the first time, by people who trusted them. I danced with my daughter that night, in a room full of strangers, and for those few minutes, none of the last 8 months mattered at all. A few weeks later, Emily came to visit me on a Sunday, the way she used to before things got complicated. We sat on the porch, and she handed me a small, worn photograph I hadn't seen in years. It was Diane, on our own wedding day, 31 years ago, laughing at something just outside the frame. I found it going through some old boxes, Emily said. I thought you should have it back. I keep it in my wallet now, same place I kept it when Diane was still alive. I think about that night often. I didn't stay quiet because I was weak, and I didn't get my seat at that wedding because I fought for it. The truth simply did what truth eventually does, if you let it. I'm not angry at Margaret anymore. She was protecting a version of control that was never really hers to hold, and losing that grip publicly was its own consequence, one I never had to engineer myself. If there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's that love doesn't need an audience to be real, and it doesn't need volume to matter. Sometimes the quietest sacrifices are the ones that end up speaking the loudest, in rooms you never expected to be standing in. If you've ever loved someone quietly, without asking for credit, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Let me know where you're watching this from tonight, and if this story meant something to you, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe. There are more stories like this one coming, and I'd love for you to be here for them.